Hi again. It's the middle of summer, so I'm struggling to get my work done. Spent the afternoon cleaning my office so that it would look better on video, and I've been worrying about how dark I appear and whether these videos are even watchable. This is a whole new thing, but it's interesting. But I want to begin the week's lectures, and they're about the topic of the Articles of Confederation and how the Articles are useful for our understanding of the Constitution. The Articles were proposed in 1777 and ratified in 1781 and replaced in 1787. So that tells you how successful they were. They were a colossal failure. They were replaced within 6 years. And there were good reasons why they were replaced. And I wanted to go over those because by learning about the failure, you learn about what the Constitution was trying to do and how it was trying to achieve its goals. Again, with summer and reading lists, there's a lot of talk about the new Harper Lee book, Go Set a Watchman, and it's generated a lot of discussion for a lot of reasons. Did she really want it published? What do we learn about Atticus Finch from it? Did we know he was a racist before? What do we think about him now that we know he's a racist? But the thing that kind of is interesting about the book to me is it tells you how to take a book that wouldn't have succeeded and make it a book that would succeed. I mean, I'm not sure it wouldn't have succeeded in its original form, but the editors who gave Harper Lee comments on it really thought that it was going to fail, and therefore wouldn't publish it until she changed it, and she changed it into a much different story that had a much different emphasis that served a much different purpose. And I imagine that the failure in the editor's responses allowed her to learn from that. And you can learn something about what something is from where it came from. In that case, ironically, the story that's set later in time informs the writing of the story that's set earlier in time. But as much as I would like to talk about Harper Lee on a nice summer day in Texas, I guess it's not Alabama, but it's Texas, I want to talk about the Articles of Confederation. And there are a couple things I really want you to get out of this discussion. The first is that the Articles failed because they created a government that was too weak, and the various reasons it was too weak. Secondly, I want you to understand how the Constitution created institutions that don't have those same weaknesses. And thirdly, I want to identify a couple of political problems that arose from those weaknesses, and that the articles, not the articles, but that the Constitution tried to address as well. And so I will begin with the articles now. The articles, we know, created a weak federal government, but in a variety of ways. One of the most recognizable problems is the government provided no ability to tax directly, so that the federal government was dependent on the states to fund it, and unless the states were acting together, something that wasn't happening very often, the government always had a problem raising the funds it needed to conduct governmental businesses. It already sort of suggested an illegitimacy or a weakness of the government, which made the government less effective. The second thing that's associated with the government's weakness, and probably the most well-known problem associated with the Articles of Confederation, is that the Articles of Confederation did not contain an executive power, a power to carry out the will of the legislature. Once a will was determined, once the legislature acted, it was up to the states to carry out the legislation, which meant that the legislation could be carried out differently in different places, or not carried out at all, depending on how the particular states thought about the legislation that was passed. The executive power is what people think about when they think about scary governments. And if a government with a very powerful executive is scary, a government without an executive is scary to the extent that you want the government to do what you've empowered that government to do. And the Articles of Confederation just couldn't do that. They couldn't execute the law. The famous example people give is Shays' Rebellion, which was a Massachusetts tax rebellion, a refusal to pay money for taxes that the government needed to fund itself and to operate. And the consequence of Shays' Rebellion was that the federal government was not only embarrassed, it inspired the Annapolis Convention that replaced the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the legislative power in the Articles of Confederation. And with legislative power, it's very important to understand how the rules that you use to constrain legislation, to explain what counts as legislation, what counts as law, determine the kind of laws you get. And the Articles of Confederation were written by people who were trying to maximize the power of the states. And so the states determined what would count as law that would be binding on them. And as you would guess, they designed an agent, a government that they could control. And you see the mechanisms of control in the Constitution, in the rules that determine what counts as legislation. Some examples. Under the Articles of Confederation, you needed 9 out of 13 states to approve legislation in order for it to be law. That doesn't mean after it's law the states have to approve it. They could veto it again, as we've seen, just by not enforcing it. But the state's representative in Congress, in the legislative body, had to vote yes. 9 states out of 13 had to vote yes, or else it wouldn't count as law. As I just implied there, the states in the Articles of Confederation were represented as states. There was a vote of the representatives from each state separately, and so you really had 13 votes, and 9 would create law. That too empowered the states, because the states were being represented as states. They weren't being, the people of the states weren't being represented independent of the states controlling the representative. And you see that most clearly, I think, when you look at the election rules that were used to both elect and control the representatives of the states in the legislature of the Articles of Confederation. Some examples. The representatives had very short terms, 1 year, so that they were constantly subject to re-election, so that they would have a greater incentive to be more responsive to the states that elected them. Secondly, they were elected by the state legislatures, the legislators of the states, which again gave them a great incentive to be responsive to the people who elected them. Thirdly, they were not elected by, they were subject to recall, which means that if they vote in a way the state doesn't like, the state could recall them, like sending a yo-yo to Washington. You don't like what they say, you jerk them back. Of course, they weren't sent to Washington at the time, they were sent to Philadelphia or New York, depending on when it's happening, but you get the idea. The states controlled the legislature, the state controlled the enforcement of the law, the states controlled the funding of the government. It created a government that was beholden to the states, and a government that was very weak, to the extent that you had to make the states do things in order to achieve the political goals of the Articles of Confederation, of the new nation. To create a nation out of a bunch of competing diverse states, the Articles of Confederation were a very poor device by which to do that. In our next talk, I will try to explain how the Constitution responds to these problems, both institutionally, in terms of the processes the Constitution creates so that the national government would have more power, and also to identify the kinds of political problems that were created under the Articles, the substantive problems that the government had to address through its laws. And I'll do that in the next talk. Thank you.